do a great job on the webinar, and I guess I'll pass it over to Blaine.
All right, well, thank you, Kama. I'm going to go ahead and do a screen share here. Just give me a moment to get my slides up. And I'll tell you a little bit about what you guys can expect today. All right, so one of my challenges always, in person or virtually, maybe especially virtually, is that I always have like an iceberg worth of content and I have time to cover the tip of it. And so it's gonna be a bit like drinking from a fire hose this morning, and I hope you'll bear with me. But if nothing else, it will hopefully keep you engaged. I want you to think of this as a podcast that you'd take a lot of notes listening to. In other words, there's not going to be a bunch of razzle dazzle on the screen. I'm not going to mesmerize you with animations and all kinds of stuff happening on the screen. But what I have done is taken what I think are some of the best ideas that I share with groups in the topic of selling. And I've literally kind of created 10 words or 10 concepts, 10 key ideas. And for each of those 10 words or key ideas, I'm going to share with you kind of 3 main subpoints. So it should be very easy for you to follow along and take whatever notes you'd like to take. 10 key ideas, each with 3 main points. And that's actually a lot to cover in the time that we have. But all of them are designed to really accomplish one thing, and that's to help you separate and differentiate from your competition. And I know it seems kind of odd right now to be talking about how do we do more business when you got more business than you can probably handle. But we know that this time is temporary, and we know that things are going to change. And of course, there's a lot of expectation that interest rates will probably go up, which means that definitely will change the amount of business you're doing, especially refi business. And now is actually the time to be thinking about how to improve and what tweaks you want to make to how you do what you do, as opposed to waiting until things change. If we wait until things change and then we're all kind of sitting around looking at each other going, oh, what do we do now? Well, that's kind of too late, right? So you want to be proactive even though you're super, super busy. So I definitely appreciate and value that you've decided to share an hour of your morning with me. And my goal is to make sure it's as impactful as it possibly can be. So I want you to first of all understand what I call my worldview of selling. If you're going to listen to a guy talk about sales for an hour, you should at least know a little bit about where he's coming from. And I have a particular worldview that you may or may not agree with, and that's totally okay either way. But my worldview is this, that selling is not about getting the sale. And I know on one hand, it's like, well, that's crazy talk. I mean, why do we do what we do if we're not trying to earn an income and make sales and, give people what they want? Well, what I really mean is that the focus of selling, in my opinion, should always be on establishing if you're the best fit. In the act of doing that, you make plenty of sales. But we've all been on the receiving end of a salesperson whose sole objective appeared to be simply making a deal. In other words, they weren't interested in building a relationship. They were interested in making a deal. And that never feels good when you're the consumer, right? When you're the customer. So a lot of what I'm going to share with you today, I want you to be thinking about, how does all of these things feel? How do they feel when you're the customer, right? When you're the one who's being impacted by a sales conversation or a salesperson, how does what they're doing make you feel as the customer? Because that's the best way that we can take these ideas and internalize them. And I'm not really going to probably share anything with you that'll be revolutionary. I mean, here are the 10 words, and there's probably not a single word on this list that you haven't at least heard of before or have some idea what that word means. So it's not so much what I'm going to say that I think is valuable today. It's what you think about what I'm going to say. In other words, the ideas, the thoughts, the impressions that you get as I'm sharing these ideas with you, that's where the value is. So I'm going to encourage you to try to resist the temptation to multitask. And I know there's distractions around you that you may not be able to control, but I would give yourself this time. Consider it an investment in you, and I think you'll find tremendous value. All right, so let's get at it. The first word is value. These aren't in any particular order, but value is obviously a really significant word. And you may be familiar with the quote from Warren Buffett that price is what you pay, value is what you get. So let me give you the Captain Obvious version of what I mean by value. I'll always give you kind of the basic definition of these words, and then we're going to dive deeper so that you can really get some more out of it. So at a very basic level, what value implies is that I need to perceive as your customer, right? So who am I? I could be a realtor, I could be a borrower, I could be a builder, I could be a financial planner, whoever you want to define as your customer. I need to perceive that there's a value in doing business with you in order for me to do business with you, right? So your job as the salesperson is to articulate that value, right, in a compelling, concise way. So I want you to imagine that you actually get the question, what's the value in doing business with you? Imagine that a realtor were to ask you, tell me what the value in working with you and your company is. How would you answer that question? We each need to have our own way of answering that question. Now, because we won't get that question, right? I mean, the questions you always get, especially from borrowers. You get questions around your pricing. You get questions around, how quickly you can close a loan. You get questions around what products you have. As you're answering those questions, you want to make sure that you're putting value into your answers. So here's some kind of sub-points that I'd like to make about value that'll help you take this a little deeper. If you're familiar with the show Shark Tank, and even if you're not, that's okay, I'll quickly explain it. The basic premise of the show is that a business owner needs more money to build their business. They need to raise capital. And so they make a pitch to these celebrity investors with the hope that these investors will invest in their company. That, in essence, is what that show is all about. So how does a person get investors to part with tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to invest in their company? If you watch the show, and even if you don't watch it regularly, I'd encourage you just to check it out. Notice what gets the investors' attention. Notice what makes people lean forward in their chair and say, tell me more about that. I'm intrigued by that. And there's really just a couple of things that seem to consistently get the investors' attention. First of all, the business owner can clearly define their value, which goes right back to what I just said a moment ago, right? They can clearly define what the value is that they offer to the marketplace. The second thing that they are able to do is to tell the investors how what they do and how they do it is different from everybody else. Pretty hard in the mortgage space to differentiate yourself, right? I mean, manufacturing a mortgage is manufacturing a mortgage. But can you find ways that you do what you do differently than your competition and make sure that people know how you're different? And I'd say there's even a third thing that stands out to those investors on Shark Tank, and that's when they're actually not even a big fan of the business or the product, but they really believe in the person. In other words, they're willing to invest their money, not so much in what this person's company produces, but in the person themselves. So they make such a compelling case that, you will want to do business with me. I could be selling almost anything, but you will want to do business with me. So those are all some very simple lessons that I think are pretty powerful that you can take from a television program. Another way to look at value is to consider the whole idea of pain and pleasure. Here's an interesting thing about being a human being. From the time we get up in the morning to the time we go to bed at night, we're really doing two things. We're seeking pleasure and we're avoiding pain. And that's pretty much what our day consists of. We're doing things that are pleasure seeking and we're doing things that are pain avoidance. So of course, researchers and psychologists, they like to study these things, and they've always wondered, well, what's the greater motivator? What motivates people more? And what they've determined is that avoiding pain is the greater motivator, that we will avoid pain over anything. So what I find interesting about that idea is that in sales, I often see that salespeople and companies are always talking about pleasure. They're always making everything sound like it's rainbows and unicorns because they don't want to scare anybody away. I mean, let's be honest. If you were to tell a person who's never gotten a mortgage before and they're talking to you about getting a mortgage, if you were to tell them what this process is really going to be like, there's some pain involved, is there not? I mean, there's the pain of how long it takes. There's the pain of how much documentation is required. I mean, just think about the things that people complain about when it comes to getting a mortgage. Those are their pain points. Well, if we just focus on those, we'll scare people away. So as salespeople, we tend to not want to talk about that stuff. What I'm suggesting is maybe part of your value proposition is how you're the pain reliever for those headaches? How are you the Tylenol for my mortgage headache? And if you're honest with me and let me know what some of the pain points are, and then more importantly, how you help relieve that pain, that will be very compelling, because everybody else I talk to will be saying things like, push button, get mortgage. And while push button, get mortgage is a very, good marketing slogan, it doesn't really define exactly what getting a mortgage is all about. So again, don't focus on pain, but at least be willing to talk about it. All right, and then here's another idea. And this kind of sounds obvious, but I just want to remind you, when we're expressing our value, it should always be from the consumer's, right, the buyer's perspective. In other words, if I'm a realtor, you need to speak my language. If I'm a first-time home buyer, you need to understand what it's like to be a first-time home buyer. Even though you might have bought your first home 30 years ago, sure, I want to know that you've got 30 years of experience, and that's all great. But what I really want to know is that you understand me. You understand as a first-time buyer exactly what's on my mind and exactly what keeps me up at night. And that needs to be reflected in what I hear from you. And one of the greatest challenges we have, the longer we're in a profession, is that we look at everything from the vantage point of someone who's experienced in this profession. I look at the world with my eyes of having 30 plus years of mortgage experience. And yet, if I'm not talking to another 30 years of experience mortgage person, I need to change my perspective to fit who I'm talking to. Again, none of these ideas are things that you may have never heard, but I'm trying to remind you of some things that maybe you haven't thought about in a long time. Okay, so that's value. Now, this presentation doesn't lend itself typically to a lot of questions unless I say something that just confuses you. But don't hesitate. If you do have questions, we'll try to take a couple of minutes at the end and answer them. And certainly if I say something that you don't understand, let me know. Okay, let's move on to the second word. Trust. Boy, is that another word that companies use all the time. But isn't it funny how we actually don't use the word? Like if you were talking to somebody for the first time, 30 seconds into a sales conversation, would you say, oh, by the way, you can totally trust me? It'd be kind of weird, wouldn't it? I mean, if somebody said that to us right away, we'd be wondering, why are they telling me that? But of course, the obvious is that we do have to trust each other, right? I do have to trust you to give you my business. So how do we develop trust and build trust without actually using the word? And you could make a good case that trust really is the foundation of any relationship. So if selling is really about building relationships, then trust has got to be a big part of that, right? So I tried to come up with some other words that might demonstrate or show how you can establish and build trust with people. So for instance, being just competent, right? Like being good at what you do helps people to trust you. Being consistent in the way you do things is very important, especially when you're manufacturing mortgages. If you have a very inconsistent process, right, or even within the processing of one loan, people have an inconsistent experience, that makes people very uncomfortable. I mean, just imagine yourself, if you were to open up your closet, and it wouldn't happen all the time, but every once in a while when you open up your closet door, a wild animal jumps out. And you don't even know what animal it will be. Last time it was a bear, this time it's a tiger. I mean, what most people would do is they'd stop opening the door, right? If I don't know what to expect, I'm not going to open up the door. And that's what happens when people are doing business with you. If they get to the point where they don't know what to expect, they just don't want to do business. And of course, being caring, showing respect. I shouldn't have to say those things. And I mean, I love the Midwest. I've spent most of my life in the Midwest. I live outside of Chicago. I always enjoy going to Minnesota. I love the people in Minnesota. You're very friendly. I don't really need to talk to you about being caring and respectful, but I'm mentioning it because there is a fair amount of disrespect out there. And maybe it's just our politics, maybe it's just all these things that are tending to make people, feel like we're divided from one another. But the more you can get away from all of that and just show people a basic care and respect, no matter our differences, the more that they will like and trust you. And of course, you want to make sure that you're also being authentic, transparent. People use those words all the time. But it's actually harder to do that than it is to say it. If I ask myself, am I honestly, truly myself all the time with everyone? I don't know, because in sales, I'm trying to earn people's business. I want to be liked. Therefore, I may not really be totally myself with certain people because I'm afraid that if I show them that part of myself, they may not like that, which means then maybe they wouldn't give me their business. And so I think we're more chameleons than we realize. Now, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but what I am saying is that if you want to attract the business, the relationships that will be the most long-term and beneficial, you actually need to truly be outrageously yourself so that you attract those people to you that like that, right? If we hide something about ourselves from people so that we can get their business, eventually we'll realize that that relationship is not really built on very solid ground, right? It's kind of like marriages where somebody gets married to someone and thinks, oh, I can change a bunch of this stuff about them, or they don't even know a lot of stuff about the person. That never really ends up working well. So that's what I mean by being authentic and transparent. And relevancy, I kind of skipped over that word, but being relevant means, again, you're speaking from their perspective. You're not trying to give people information they don't need. You're not speaking in a way that they don't understand. You're speaking to their needs, their wants, their desires, their fears, etc. Okay, what else about trust? These are the two words that are really important in building trust. People need to trust your capabilities, which means you need to somehow help people to trust that you can do what you said you can do. Now, one of the things you can control is your promises, right? You can control the commitments that you make. So try as best you can, and we can't be perfect at this stuff, but try as best you can to be a person of your word, to not overextend yourself, right? To not make commitments that you can't fully keep. And the other thing that people have to trust is your intent, which means I, as the buyer, need to know that you, as the salesperson, are looking out for me and not for you. That your primary reason for even wanting to do business with me is an act of service. That you're looking for my best interests, not for yours. And again, remember what it feels like when you're talking to a salesperson whose only care seems to be the commission they're going to make on this sale. We've all been in those conversations or interactions with people when we're on the receiving end, and that never feels right, right? When we can sense that about a person. All right, last thing about trust. If you've had experience in a small town, living or working in a small town, you know how important trust is. And you know that business is done a little differently in a small town. Because when you do business with somebody in a small town, it's not like you're never going to see them again. You're going to run into that person like at least once a week. You're going to see them at the store. You're going to see them at the post office. You're going to, wherever in that town you do your thing, you're going to see these people that you do business with. And so you tend to do business a little differently when you do business in a small town. Well, the Twin Cities is not exactly a small town, right? So if you do business in a larger city, couldn't we still just act as if we were in a small town? Couldn't we still do business as if we lived in that community? We were doing business with our neighbors. I think, honestly, if I look at myself, I would behave a little differently if I was selling to people in my own community than if I'm selling to people that I may never see again. So again, not telling anybody on this call what to do or how to do it. You guys are good at what you do, or you wouldn't have even signed up for this session. But I am trying to just get you to think about some things that maybe you haven't thought about before. Okay, so we've talked about value, we've talked about trust. Let's move on to the third word that companies love to talk about, which is empathy. And maybe one of the best definitions of empathy that I've come across is when you care about what the people you care about care about. In other words, we can have a conversation and you can tell me about the challenges you're having in raising teenage children. And I can have sympathy and compassion for the challenges you might have in raising teenage children. And I could never have had children at all, right? I could be childless. I could have never had children, and I can still have compassion and sympathy for your situation. But I can't have empathy for you unless I've raised teenagers too. Now, obviously, the raising of my teenagers is never going to be exactly the same as the raising of your teenagers. But you'll notice it's those things that connect people. like if you can remember back to when we used to have networking events and we were meeting in person, and you're just meeting somebody for the first time and you're talking about various things, all of a sudden you find out that you both have daughters that are into horses. And this is a professional event. And yet you'll spend the next 30 minutes talking to this person about the world of horses that your daughters are involved in. It's when we can find those connections with people where we have a shared or similar experience that we actually bond. So what I'm suggesting is that we be looking for those opportunities to really show empathy, to be able to say, I've been there, right? I'm with you, I understand. See, everybody wants to feel heard. Everybody wants to feel understood. And that's where empathy is a really powerful tool. Now, you've probably heard of IQ, right? Your IQ is a measurement of intelligence. It's only a particular type of intelligence, right? So we should never put people down because they don't have a high IQ, but it doesn't change much in your lifetime. You take a test, you could take the test when you're in high school, you could take the test as an adult, your IQ is going to be about the same. You may have heard of this thing called EQ, which is your emotional intelligence. That you can improve upon. And all of us, honestly, can get better at what I call people skills. Managing our emotional state, being able to read people, right? That's EQ. So if you've never really looked into this before, I can share a couple of resources with you. If you're on LinkedIn, look up Travis Bradberry. Travis Bradberry is an EQ guru, and he posts a newsletter, I think once a week or so, and you can just get that, via LinkedIn or sign up for his newsletter. His company, I believe, is called Talent Smart. So if you go to talentsmart.com, you'll probably be able to sign up for, free information there. And now not because of, but especially now with the massive amount of change that's been thrust upon, honestly, the entire planet with the pandemic, they're starting to understand, the people that study behavior, there's another type of intelligence, which is adaptability, right? Your ability to adapt to change. Now that could be a whole webinar in and of itself, so I won't get into any details on that. But the most important one for our conversation today is EQ, being able to get better at what I call people skills. I'm going to be very brief on the 3 M's because that's something that if I had more time, I go into deeper. But why I'm tying this into empathy is because you want to make sure that there's consistency, right? Remember, people want to be heard and understood. So whoever it is you're talking to, let's say that's your market. I'm talking to a first-time homebuyer, or I'm talking to a millennial, or I'm talking to an African-American, or I'm talking to a realtor, talking to a new realtor, talking to an experienced realtor. In other words, define who it is that you're trying to communicate with. The method that you use to communicate with them, first of all, needs to be in alignment with how they want to receive information, right? And you need to have your information wherever they would go looking for it, right? That's why there's been such an emphasis over the years in having an online presence, having a social media presence, because if people are going online and using social media to learn information or learn about you specifically, what will they find, right? If they don't find anything, if I go to YouTube, because YouTube is the second largest search engine behind Google, if I go to YouTube and do a search for mortgage types of questions, is there anything with you or your company that will show up, right? Because if you're not in that space where I would go for information, then you kind of don't exist. And maybe most importantly, your message, what you have to say to me, needs to be in alignment, again, with who I am and how I want to receive the information. So it's kind of like I'm repeating a common theme here about from the buyer's perspective, or from the realtor's perspective, from your customer's perspective. Everything needs to be tailored so that people receive information how and what they're looking for. All right, but the last thing I want to say about empathy is that truly the one skill that we can all get better at is what I call the art of conversation. I realize that more and more of our business, even before the pandemic, is virtual, right? More and more now we're dealing with people via email, via texting, but I think our ability to actually converse with people, right? Listen to people, have eye contact with people. These are actually the things that build empathy much better than you could ever do virtually. And we can get better at the art of conversation. So let me give you another resource. There's a great book called We Need to Talk. We Need to Talk. The author's name is Celeste Headley. Celeste Headley. Now, if you don't have time or you're not interested in reading her book, you could at least check out her TED Talk if you're familiar with the TED Talks. If you go to TED.com and do a search for her, you'll see that she has about a 20-minute TED Talk that is a lot of the information that would be in her book. But I highly encourage you to check that out. We can all get better at those things. Okay, moving on. And I apologize for the funky word. You know, I like to use language that is probably 7th or 8th grade. And I don't mean any disrespect. I just like to communicate in a way that's totally understood by everybody, right? I don't want to be confusing people with my language. And honestly, the word specificity, kind of strange. I just haven't found a better word. So let's talk about another marketing expression called competitive advantages. Basically, why should I do business with you, especially when you're not Walmart? Meaning you don't have the lowest price. Because I'm going to lead with that question, aren't I? When I call you up, I'm likely going to say, what's your rate? Now, just for a moment, imagine that if I asked you what your rate is and your response to me was, Blaine, I'm so glad you asked. You know, we are all about lower rates here. That's one of our corporate values, low rates. I'm sorry, I'm looking for a number. You know, I'm shopping around, I'm calling different places. Everybody's given me a number. What is your interest rate? Blaine, that's a great question because we are totally committed at ABC Lending to low rates all day, all the time. I mean, this would be ridiculous, right? You'd give me a number. And yet, when you talk about your people, when you talk about your service, even when you talk about yourself, are we as specific? Or do we say things like, we're all about customer service here. We're very focused on delivering value to our customers. We close loans very quickly. We're easy to do business with. I mean, right? I mean, I walked into many institutions over the years, right? Many different mortgage lenders across the country, and I would see posters and plaques and banners on the wall that spoke to things like their core values, their mission, their beliefs. It all kind of sounds the same. I'm not saying those aren't good things to say. It's a great thing to say that you focus on value or that you're very interested in providing good customer service. Those are good things to say, but they don't mean anything, especially when everybody says it. So I would encourage you to do an exercise with your team when you have a moment. So that may not be now, right? That may not be in this time period, but when you have a moment, brainstorm. What are your competitive advantages? You're looking for things that are not price, unless you want to be Walmart. I mean, if you want to be the Walmart of mortgage lenders, then it's all about price. But beyond price, what are your competitive advantages? What are things that are unique about doing business with you? What are things that are in your DNA? This is what you stand for. Sometimes this is very personal, isn't it? Like when you do business with me, this is what you can expect. Having done that exercise, then I would say, find ways to be specific about all of those things. Find ways to measure customer satisfaction, to measure how long it takes you to close a loan, to measure your staff. Well, how do we do that? Can't I just tell people we have a great team? No, speak to things like average years of experience, minimum years of experience, amount of training that everybody gets every year. In other words, you can talk about your people and still be specific. This takes some work, by the way, right? Which is why a lot of people never take the time to do it. And don't forget that the experience that a realtor or a borrower has is what you need to be speaking to as well. Because remember, we are experts in manufacturing mortgage loans. We are experts in the process of mortgage lending. Nobody getting a mortgage cares about that, really. To them, it's an experience. So how is that experience an advantage over other places? And of course, don't forget the power of third-party testimonials, examples. This is why we want those testimonials. We want people to rate us, right? Whether it's online or an email, or we want people to share what their experience was, especially when it's positive, so that we can pull those out to show other people and say, well, you don't have to take my word for it. I mean, I could tell you that I'm great at what I do, but here's a whole binder full of people who basically have endorsed me. One of the most powerful statistics that you can share is what is the percentage of your business that is either repeat or referred to you. If you're tracking how your business comes to you, you can come up with what that percentage tends to be. What percentage of your business is either repeat or referred? And honestly, it almost doesn't matter what that number is. When you just start sharing that number, like, 30% of my business is repeat or referred. That sounds way more impressive than almost anything else that you can say. And then it's not you telling people that you're trustworthy and you're good at what you do, because basically other people are vouching for you. Okay, the fire hose continues. Let's move on to expectations. And let's talk about building proper expectations as it relates to satisfaction levels. Okay, so here's the thing. You do this already. Hopefully, you're spending time, especially early on with people, setting proper expectations. All right, here's why this is so important, by the way. We'll go through 3 levels of satisfaction. The first is when people are simply satisfied. They're just satisfied. So think about yourself as a consumer. You bought a product or you hired someone to perform a service. What would they have to do for, at the end of that, for you to basically say, I'm satisfied? And my formula is that they met your expectations. If you meet people's expectations, they will be satisfied. So the captain obvious part of this discussion is that you don't have a prayer of meeting people's expectations if you aren't involved in setting them. I mean, is that not true? You probably already know this. You cannot possibly meet people's expectations unless you are involved in setting them. But let's do better than just satisfy people. Let's at least impress people. Now, you already know how to do that because you've heard the formula. You don't just meet expectations, you exceed expectations. That sounds great. So I'm just going to tell you to go out and to consistently exceed people's expectations, and that's how you impress people. And then you're going to wonder, how in the world do we do that? Well, I have a formula for that as well, and it's one you've heard before. Try to get into the habit of consistently under-promising. Build yourself a cushion in everything you do. Now, our human nature is to not do that. Human nature is to stretch yourself. Human nature is to overpromise, especially when you're competing for the business, right? They're talking to lots of people. You're trying to earn their business. Our nature is to, yeah, we can close it that quickly, even though you're thinking to yourself, oh, I hope we can really close it that quickly. See, I'm willing to let business walk away that has unrealistic expectations. Because if that's the only reason that somebody wants to do business with me is they have some crazy expectation that they're trying to force me to commit to, this is not a relationship. This is not a long-term relationship that I'm interested in building anyway. I'd rather let that business go. And of course, they're going to go to somebody who's promising the moon, and you know what's going to happen. They're not going to get the moon, and they're going to realize all along that you were really the much more reasonable choice. But in the meantime, okay, they went someplace else. I'd much rather please people on the back end than on the front end. I'd much rather people be a little unsure or a little disappointed up front and then cheering at the end because it was faster than I said, or it was easier than I said, or it was cheaper than I said. We're always enthusiastic when it was better, easier, faster, cheaper than we thought it was going to be. Well, that's on us to establish that expectation. And then there's even a level higher up, and that's when you simply amaze people. And the way that you amaze people, and you can't do this very often, but it's when you can actually anticipate what their expectations are, be in front of that need or requirement before they've even told you. It'd be like if we were in a room together and I just walked up to someone randomly in the room and I gave you some Tylenol and a cup of water and walked away. And then by looking at your confusion, your confused expression, oh, I'm sorry, I should have told you. You're going to need that in about 8 minutes. Of course, the reaction in the room, you can imagine, would be, this is like a joke, right? This is a magic trick. What is this? What if in 8 minutes, your head started to hurt? See, I knew it was coming, but you would be absolutely amazed. How did I know? How could someone have possibly known? Are there not opportunities in the manufacturing of a mortgage where you can anticipate how a person is going to react or what a person is going to need before they even know that? And you can get in front of that expectation with your solution or your relief or your help. There are opportunities for us to do that. Like I said, this doesn't happen every day on every loan, but when you can do that, that's when people are wowed about you. Okay, so that first set of 5 words, I dwell on those a little longer because they require that you come up with your own definitions. They require that you come up with your own ideas. And one of the common themes of those, whoops, my microphone just went flailing with my gesturing. One of the things that happens, or that I'm encouraging you to do, is to communicate these ideas without being asked, right? To communicate value without being asked, what's your value? To communicate trust without someone having to say, can I trust you? To communicate empathy just because you naturally do. These are the things I think we can all get better at. But let's move on to kind of a second set of skills. They're a little different and they're more like your routines, your habits, the things that you do. So it's really important that you, again, know that I'm not here to tell anybody how to do what you do. Simply sharing best practices and ideas, and you can try them on for size and use what works and discard the rest. Okay, this is not a to-do list. This is not a prescription. These are simply ideas that, as a fellow mortgage professional, I'd like to share with you. So I want to talk a little bit about discipline. The late Jim Rohn had this idea that discipline weighs ounces, regret weighs tons. And I think what he was suggesting is that when we have the opportunity to be disciplined, right? Think about something that requires discipline, like dieting or eating better or getting up early to exercise when that's not what you would normally do. There's a certain amount of pain to do that discipline, a weight. So we often choose not to, right? Because remember, we avoid pain at all costs. That's why diets don't work, by the way. I studied nutrition. And as soon as I saw that the first 3 letters of the word diet, right, what do they spell? I mean, and honestly, that's what a lot of people feel like when you tell them that they can no longer eat the things that they like to eat, right? There's a lot of pain in that process, and we will avoid pain at all costs, which is why we ultimately don't follow through. But what Jim is suggesting is that if you look back over time, and let's say that 10 years ago, you could have made the decision to engage in a discipline that would have paid dividends 10 years later, but you chose not to. And now there's a regret that you didn't do what you knew you could have done. What he's suggesting is that that regret is actually a heavier weight or a larger pain than the pain of the discipline. It's just that the pain of the discipline is right now. Regret, that's later, right? I won't regret this decision for a long time. The discipline in the moment is what I'm trying to focus on, and that's immediate, and that's why we often pass on that. So here's some disciplines I'm suggesting you think about. The discipline of intention, which is knowing your why. Things like, why are you even in this business? Why do you do what you do? Why do you work for who you work for? Why do you live where you live, right? You're not a tree. You could live anywhere. Why do you live where you live? Why do you hang out with the people you hang out with? Why is the stuff that's in your calendar on your calendar? When you look at your, credit card statement every month, if you review that, why are you spending your money the way you spend your money? I'm not suggesting that you be a 4-year-old and wander around all day going, why, right? That would be exhausting. But I think sometimes we get so busy in our habits and our routines, we forget to check in with ourselves. Why is this stuff important to me? Why am I spending my time and my money and my energy in the way that I'm spending it? Also, the ability to pay attention. You could use the word focus, right? The ability to focus, the ability to reflect, to think back on the day, on the meeting, on the sales call. We often don't take the time to do these things. That's a discipline. And of course, time, managing time. Oh my goodness, is there a tremendous amount of effort in trying to manage our time? And so these are common struggles that we all have to figure out how to manage, right? The difference between urgent and important. The late Stephen Covey talked about this decades ago. If we're chasing what's urgent, we often neglect what's important. And of course, if we neglect what's important, then those things become more urgent. I mean, it's a challenge to reconcile all that. Or what about the difference between efficient and effective? In other words, we might take the shortcut because it's more efficient, but we lose effectiveness in the process. Texting is a good example of that, right? Texting is very efficient, but it's often not effective in terms of an ability to communicate. I mean, you've texted somebody back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and thought to yourself, if I could just talk to them for like 30 seconds, I could clear this whole thing up. It's a challenge. Now, I've listed 3 reasons why these are challenges. 3 reasons why we don't do some of this stuff as well as we could. We are distracted beyond belief. I mean, I don't know that we've ever been more distracted. And by the way, this is not going to change. We can't wave a magic wand and suddenly we're no longer distracted. If anything, the distractions will increase over time. So we have to find ways, disciplined ways to manage our distractions. We're also sold on this myth of multitasking. And you don't have to take my word for it, but multitasking is indeed a myth. It's what machines do, by the way. It's not what the human brain does. Computers multitask. Brains multi-switch. Your brain does not have the ability to truly multitask. So when you're doing multiple things at the same time, your focus, your primary focus is simply shifting from one thing to another. And in that shifting, you're actually losing productivity, potentially. So that's a challenge we all have to work with. And precrastination, that's not a typo. Precrastination is a word you may not have heard before. So procrastination means we put things off, which I'm really good at, by the way. Precrastination is the opposite problem. It's when we feel that everything has to be done right this second, right now. When you get a text, when do you respond? Right now. Well, what if you're driving? I still try to reply right now. So even though that's like crazy town, right? I mean, would I go to my children's driver's education teacher and say, hey, could you make sure you really teach them how to text and drive? No, I would tell my kids, do not, under any circumstances, play with your phone while you're driving down the highway at 70 miles an hour. And yet, guilty as charged, right? So why would we feel compelled to play with our phone when we're operating a motor vehicle? Because we feel like everything has to be done right now. That's precrastination. Now, if you're looking for a solution to these problems, unfortunately, I don't have the solution because I suffer from all of these things as much as anybody. I'm just suggesting that these are some things, these are some areas where more discipline might be in order. But again, that's for you to decide, right? Okay, listening. Not going to dwell on this. We've heard it all before. We can be better listeners. We should be better listeners. How do we actually become better listeners, and why should we? Victor Hugo had this expression about when a woman is talking to you, listen to what she says with her eyes. It takes real listening to be able to pick up what someone is telling you with their eyes, right? Now, I realize a lot of times we're not dealing with people face to face, and so that doesn't necessarily apply, but the point is still relevant. So what can we do to be better listeners? Well, simply removing distractions would be a good start. Even though I've convinced myself that I can watch a game on TV while my wife is talking to me, okay, for some conversations, sure, no harm. For other conversations, what do I need to do? At least turn away from the television, or better yet, turn it off or mute it. Leave it so that I can focus on what my wife is telling me. It's as simple as that. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's simple. We also need to show more interest when people are talking, right? Asking questions helps our mind, which is like, what do they call it? Monkey mind, where it's like we're constantly jumping around from thoughts to thoughts all the time. When we ask a person questions, we're more engaged, we're more invested in listening to what they say. And of course, really the art of listening is that you're seeking to understand them as opposed to simply trying to reply. Because most of the time, honestly, when somebody's talking to us, we're anticipating where they're going and we're coming up with our response before they've even finished talking. It's just kind of human nature to do that. So to change that, we need to have our focus be, I'm seeking to understand you, as opposed to I'm simply going to reply to you. And again, this is not stuff that has to be like, 24/7. Every conversation you ever have with anybody, you have to have this deep, intense focus. It's not what I'm suggesting at all, but we need to have the skill. We need to have the ability to do it. Okay, moving on. You've probably heard that the sale happens in the follow-up. So true. And yet, this is where I see salespeople really, honestly, be pathetic. So in the sales process, there's this thing called the close, right? Which is simply asking for the order. And the close has kind of a negative connotation to it because it implies that you're convincing, you're persuading, you're twisting somebody's arm. That's just because it's been done poorly so many times by so many people. If you honestly believe that you have something of value that you can offer to someone who would benefit from what you have, why would you not offer that? Why would you not say, are you interested? Right? I mean, if we believe in what we're doing and we've asked good questions and we know that we can help a person, why would we not offer to help, right? So one of the problems with closing is the hesitancy to close, right? Because we're scared of rejection or, whatever our reasons might be, we don't want to close. The other problem with closing is the opposite problem, where people are constantly trying to close, right? ABC, always be closing. And I'm not trying to offend anybody that may believe in that philosophy, but I just don't think it's appropriate. I don't think people like the pressure of having somebody always try to close them. So the solution to these issues is the art of follow-up, which is simply agreeing on what comes next. And so what I would encourage you to do is in any interaction that you have, agree on the next step. Where do we go from here? And then do it. Now that's the part that's tricky, because honestly, a lot of people aren't very organized, or they don't have systems and processes in place where they can capture all these commitments they've made, right? I said I would call Mary in 2 weeks if I didn't hear from her. You need some sort of a system so that in 2 weeks, something gets your attention to say, if you haven't heard from Mary, you need to call her. A lot of lack of follow-up is not a lack of intent. It's not a uncaring. It's that people aren't very organized and they make commitments and they can't follow through because they just don't know how to keep track of all their commitments, right? So you don't want to be that person. Even the closing of a loan could be looked at it as the beginning of a relationship, right? So what kind of follow-up could you have after the closing of a loan? Well, how about if I call you in a month and check in and see how you like your new house? Right? We've agreed on a next step. I put it in my calendar or my organizer or whatever keeps me honest. And then 30 days from now, I call the person and check in with them and see how they love their new house. If you can just get good consistently at follow-up, it really does set you apart from so many people. Imagine a tennis match, and you've all at least got some idea what happens in tennis, right? People are on opposite side of a court where there's a net in the middle, and with a racket, they're hitting a ball over the net back and forth until it either goes out of bounds or they can't hit it back, right? You know the idea. Well, just imagine you're sitting in the stands at this championship tennis match, and the first person serves the ball over the net to the other person, and instead of hitting it back, they pick up the ball with their hand, they stick it in their pocket, and they walk off the court. I mean, everybody would be stunned, right? Like, what just happened here? That's not how you play tennis. And yet, I see that with salespeople all the time. The ball is in your court, so to speak, and instead of doing something, a next step, they pick up the ball, they stick it in their pocket, and they walk off the court. There's so much of an opportunity for increased business and professionalism if we'll do the right thing, which leads me to posture. My shoulders kind of hunch forward, especially when I was younger. And so I'm sure there were relatives that told me over time, stand up straight, Blaine. You look better if you stand up straight. Well, I'm not quite talking about that. Your posture is your professionalism. And that's a whole half an hour in and of itself. So I wanted to use this as an opportunity to let you know, if you didn't know already, because we really don't market this much. We have a whole series of podcasts that I've recorded, 2 different seasons already on the books, that are on our Insights webpage. And you can sign up for these if you go to, Spotify, Google, iTunes, and search for ArchMI. You can find the podcast there as well. But I have a whole podcast on what I call the 9 Ps of professionalism, and lots of other topics. In fact, many of the things we've talked about today, I go into more depth because each of the podcasts is about a half an hour on average. So I wanted to make sure that you knew those. But for today, social media is where we kind of show up, right? And every piece of communication, emails, texting, all that stuff is where you show up. We often don't know how we're being received. I mean, you can kind of gauge it by how people respond, or if you're on social media, do people comment? Do people like what you had to say? That kind of gives you some feedback. But honestly, if we really want to get better at expressing ourselves in the way that we intended, we have to get more objective feedback. So find someone that you know and trust and who cares enough about you that they will help you when you want some help, right? Before you send that email, before you post that post, if you think that it really, I want to make sure this really comes across the way I intended, have someone take a look at it. Have someone listen to it before you click send, before you click reply, before you put something out there on social media that never goes away, right? Get some feedback so that you know how you're being perceived. That's what posture is all about. Okay, and finally, another topic that we could spend a half an hour on, but obviously we don't have that kind of time, is the whole idea of planning, which I know sounds like, oh yeah, right. Yeah, Blaine, planning. Anybody plan 2020 correctly? Anybody have on their 2020 calendar what's actually happened in 2020? I mean, it's like, we can throw planning out the window. Well, see, it's not planning itself, or it's not the plan itself where the value is. What the value is in planning is the act of planning. And yet there are some common challenges that I think we have. So when you're looking forward and you're looking at your goals and your bucket list and the things that you want to make plans for, I know that we're in a very uncertain time, and I know it's more difficult than ever to make plans because so much is unknown and uncertain about the future. But there are some common struggles beyond all of that that we tend to have. And so I would encourage you to look at planning in 3 ways, right? That there's a worst case and a best case and a most likely case, right? Give yourself some options so that regardless of how things turn out, you can still feel good about your plan. Because when you only have one plan with one particular outcome, if that's not the outcome you get, then we often feel very disappointed about our plan. And that's not necessary. We don't need to beat ourselves up about that. Also, we struggle with the strategy part. Like, what am I supposed to actually do to implement my plan? And the common struggles are that we have way too many things that we're saying we're going to do. That's why New Year's resolution lists, if they're really lists, like lots of things, are doomed to fail. We also put things on our plan that are not really any different than what we already do. So I want to be in better shape, right? I've got a high school reunion, or I've got a whatever coming up. I want to increase my fitness and lose some weight, but I don't really put in on my plan that I'm going to do anything differently. That's a problem. Or the last struggle that people have is that they put stuff in their plan that honestly they're not going to do because they hate it. So if you're in sales and let's say you were actually trying to find more business, which I know you're not probably doing right now, but if you were trying to find more business, you might say, cold calling. I know what I'll do. I'll just start calling people that I don't know. Well, that is a strategy for sure. But if you'd rather have a root canal than cold call people, why would you have that in your plan? You're not going to do it. And these are struggles that we all have with planning. And don't forget the power of subtraction. Honestly, anything of any significance that I have achieved, I have only achieved it because in the act of going for it, right? In the act of achieving it, I had to let a lot of stuff go along the way. I had to take things off my calendar. I had to get myself out of commitments. because all of those things were going to restrict my ability to achieve what I was trying to achieve. That is very difficult to do. We don't do that well. And there's lots of other ways of looking at this, right, that have been said better than I can say it. Being busy is a choice, so is balance. You can't reach for anything new if your hands are full. The more you bring into your life, the more you dilute what you can do well. I mean, this has been said over and over again by lots of people. So letting go, having a let go of list is maybe just as important as having a to-do list. Okay, Blaine, take a breath, take a pause. We are at the top of the hour. These are the 10 key words. I highly encourage you, just take one idea. I know that sounds kind of, I don't, when something is said a lot, nobody really, doesn't have meaning anymore. Honestly, I've given you a lot potentially to think about or do or work on. Start with one thing. You can come back to your notes later when that one thing has done what it needs to do. Honestly, if you try to do too much after hearing all these ideas, it will not work out well for you. So I want to thank you for your time. Make sure that you've got my email address so that if you have questions or comments, you can reach out to me directly. On social media, pretty much LinkedIn would be the place to connect with me if you're interested in doing that. But I don't want to take any more of your time, so I want to turn it back over to Roger, and thank you guys so much for your time.
Well, thanks, Blaine. Really appreciate the presentation. This is some great information, and like you had mentioned, it's stuff that we've all heard. Most of it we've probably heard it, and we get in these times like we are right now, and we forget to execute. So,
right.
It's a great reminder. I know I took several notes here myself of things that I need to remember to do and do them, correctly. So, thank you very much.
Very welcome.
If anybody has any follow-up items, send your questions, I guess, to either connect with Blaine directly through LinkedIn or his information here, or, get a hold of the office, and I'm sure we can get you connected up as well. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great week, and we hope to see you at our next virtual event.
Thanks, everybody.